It began quietly, not with an alarm clock, not with traffic, not with a phone screen glowing in the dark, but with something slower, something gentler, a dim, gray light pressing faintly through the frost-laced glass of a small apartment window, a soundless kind of light, the kind that didn't startle you into wakefulness, but settled like a blanket on the walls, the bed, the books on the shelf. You didn't jump out of bed, you stirred, you blinked slowly, unsure whether it was morning or not, because the winters were long and the sun slow to rise. In Soviet cities, mornings didn't scream into life. They sighed. The apartment was cold, not painfully so, not dangerous, but cold in the way that made you hesitate before pulling the blanket aside. Cold in the way that the floor would be when your bare feet met the linoleum. Cold in the way that your breath briefly fogged the air, even indoors. The radiators, if they were working, clanked now and then like old ghosts in the walls, offering occasional warmth in short bursts of metal breath. You knew not to count on them. You just lived around them. The walls were beige or gray, peeling slightly at the corners. The wallpaper had a floral pattern, but the flowers were tired, pale blues, worn browns, the kind of colors that made no demands of you. On a small table, maybe the only table, there was a chipped porcelain cup with a spoon still inside it. It would have been used the night before for tea. Almost everything was used for tea at some point. There were no rich smells of breakfast wafting from the kitchen, not unless it was a special day. Most mornings, it was kasha, porridge made from buckwheat or semolina, plain, filling, sometimes with sugar if there was enough, sometimes just warm and simple, sometimes nothing at all. A piece of dark rye bread with a thin slice of butter, if you were lucky, or lard if you weren't. Food was fuel, not joy, not indulgence, just a necessity before the day began. The stove in the kitchen was gas, old and white. It hissed when lit, and the flame had to be coaxed with a match held in steady fingers. The kettle, deaded, loud, sat on top, ready to boil. You always boiled more than you needed, because someone else would need tea soon, and because a full kettle made the kitchen feel more complete. There was no rush in those early moments. You dressed slowly, layering sweaters and wool socks. The clothing was often thick, home-knit, and rough to the touch. Shirts with slightly crooked buttons, pants that had been patched and ration, scarves that had belonged to someone else once, a coat that still smelled faintly of winter storage. You dressed like you were leaving for a walk across a foreign tundra, even if you were just going downstairs. Outside the window, the world was muffled. In winter, it was white, but not pure. The snow had settled into a kind of quiet resignation. It pressed against sidewalks, sagged on rooftops, coated the corners of buses that idled too long. In summer, it was the sound of birds echoing through courtyards between cement buildings, the rustle of leaves and the heavy drone of flies around market stalls. But always it was slow. The Soviet Union did not move quickly in the morning. There was no espresso, no clamor for early meetings, no aggressive productivity. The idea of a morning routine was foreign. You simply got ready, and you did what had to be done. That was the rhythm of life. In the hallway, the neighbors' doors remained closed, but the smells seeped through: cabbage, soap, sometimes cigarettes. Occasionally, the sweet, earthy smell of boiled potatoes. You could tell who was cooking what without ever opening your door. The walls were thin. You heard footsteps, coughing, water running. You heard a father yelling softly at a child to hurry, but not unkindly. You heard life. The apartment block was tall and gray, a Khrushchyovka, likely one of the many thousands built across the country in the 1960s and 70s, designed to be efficient, affordable, and uniform. Concrete boxes with narrow stairwells and elevators that groaned like old men. Each one held 100 quiet stories. They were not beautiful buildings, but they were homes. And when you opened the front door to step outside, the cold greeted you like an old friend. You pulled your coat tighter, your hat lower. Maybe the bus would be on time. Maybe it wouldn't. There were no smartphone apps to check. You waited. And when it came, you boarded with a dozen other people. No one smiled. No one needed to. It was morning. Everyone was half asleep, but in their pockets, folded carefully. Many carried a piece of bread wrapped in wax paper, or a sugar cube, or a boiled egg in a paper napkin, just enough to get through. The bus windows were fogged with breath. Inside, people stood quietly. They swayed together as the vehicle turned, each of them lost in their thoughts. No headphones. No podcasts. Just silence, the drone of the engine, and the occasional announcement from the driver, mumbled, indifferent. And yet, there was something comforting in this shared hush, a unity in the way everyone existed beside one another without noise. No one was alone, not truly. The state might have been cold, the rules harsh, the bureaucracy endless. But people still showed up side by side every morning, in heavy boots, in woolen coats, with faces soft from sleep and hands stuffed into pockets. Back in the apartment, someone else was just waking. A child turning over under quilt, clinging to warmth. A babushka putting on her slippers to make tea. A student rubbing frost off the window pane. In every flat, behind every door. Another small world was beginning, slowly, quietly. And so the day unfolded, without rush, without music, without spectacle, but with rhythm. A rhythm carved by seasons, shaped by scarcity, softened by familiarity. It wasn't built to be beautiful. That was never the point. The Khrushchyovka was a solution, a compromise between dreams and resources, space and speed. It rose quickly like weeds after rain, identical from one town to the next. Gray rectangles, narrow stairwells, flat facades. These were homes made of cement and haste. And yet, inside them, life bloomed, stubbornly, quietly, and without fanfare. To understand what it meant to live in one of these buildings, you have to step inside slowly, not as a historian, not with curiosity, but as someone coming home. At the end of a long day, imagine the elevator doesn't work. It rarely does, so you take the stairs. The railing is chipped. The lights flicker, or perhaps one bulb is out entirely. The scent is always the same, a mix of stone dust, boiled cabbage, and age. The door to each apartment is different, though the outside of the building is uniform. Each family has left their mark, a sticker, the curtain in the glass window, a nameplate, a number scratched into the wood. When the door opens, everything changes. Inside, the walls may still be thin, but the world becomes warmer, not necessarily in temperature, but in feeling. There is something deeply human about a small space filled with effort, and that's what these homes were, places where effort lived. The apartment was likely between 30 to 50 square meters, sometimes shared between multiple generations. A hallway barely wide enough for coats, a kitchen so small that only one person could cook at a time, a bathroom with a water heater mounted high, painted the same color as the pipes. A single sink served the entire family, sometimes dripping, always in use. Every item had a place. Every surface was claimed. The wallpaper was often peeling. Patterns ranged from faded florals to geometric confusion. Whatever was available. Paints were stay tissue, colors chosen not by taste but by inventory, blue, beige, or something in between. And yet, these walls held memories. They listened to lullabies, muffled arguments, Sunday broadcasts on the radio, watch whatever was playing, cartoons, news, concerts from Red Square. The signal was grainy, but the moment was clear. Togetherness. The walls absorbed everything. The quiet worry when a husband came home late from the factory, the whispered hopes that a cousin might bring oranges from Moscow, the click of a knitting needle, the creak of the floorboards at night, the sound of life compressed into 40 square meters. These apartments were not luxurious, but they were stable for many families. They were the first space they'd ever owned, after decades of communal housing, barracks, and shared kitchens. To have one's own front door, even if the lock was fragile, that was something, a symbol of having made it. Children grew up in these rooms, played games in narrow hallways, hid behind heavy curtains, used emptied bottles as bowling pins, learned to ride tricycles between kitchen chairs, drew pictures that were taped to refrigerators with used adhesive. They didn't know they lacked anything. How could they? This was the world. And it was enough. And behind every closed door in the Khrushchyovka, there were stories. A young woman preparing for her university entrance exam under the weak light of a desk lamp. An old man polishing his military medals. A mother sewing patches on a winter coat while listening to the radio. A teenager writing poetry in secret, hoping no one would find it. Life was not always joyful, but it was full of quiet struggle, full of tiny victories, full of routines that formed the backbone of endurance. Outside, the building looked tired, cracks in the cement, paint flaking from the balcony rails, satellite dishes installed in crooked rows. But inside there was warmth, not from the radiators, but from the living, from the soft presence of being together in close quarters, where everything mattered because there wasn't room for anything that didn't. The Khrushchyovka was not just a building. It was a container for hope, a vessel for survival, a cocoon in a system that often felt too big, too cold, too indifferent. It was imperfect, but it was something to hold onto. And when the night came, as it always did, early in winter, late in summer, the lights behind those windows blinked into being, one by one, small squares of yellow softness against the gray. You could walk past them in silence, counting the lives. Someone reading, someone cooking, someone singing softly to a child. And in that moment, it didn't matter what the building looked like from the outside, because inside it was home, the rhythm of life in tight quarters, where privacy was a luxury and togetherness was survival. Before the Khrushchyovka, before private kitchens, before separate bathrooms, before locks that kept a hallway out, there were the communalkas, communal apartments, a single flat partitioned and repartitioned, sometimes divided again, entire families living behind single doors, not behind walls, but curtains, not beside strangers, but almost within them. And in those cramped, narrow spaces, a different kind of life unfolded, one defined not by solitude, but by proximity. To enter a communal apartment in the Soviet Union was to step into a world where every sound, every smell, every habit became public. You were never alone, not truly. Even your silence brushed up against someone else's. The hallway might be dim, cluttered with shoes and buckets, the walls scuffed from decades of passing shoulders. A dozen keys hung on hooks beside the door, each one for a different family, though they all shared the same front entrance. Behind each door or draped curtain was a small room, barely enough for a bed and a table. Some rooms held two beds, some held 3 generations, grandparents, children, even distant cousins all lived within the same 4 walls. Closets were rare, personal space rarer still. A family's possessions might all be stacked in one corner. A stack of books, a chipped teapot, a suitcase tucked beneath a cot never fully unpacked. The kitchen was shared. That is where the real negotiations of daily life played out. Imagine 4 families, maybe more, each with their own rhythm, their own meals, their own way of boiling water, each with a shelf in the cupboard marked in pencil or scratched in with a knife. Petrov, Sokolov, Ivanova. The gas stove might have 4 burns, but it was never enough. Pots waited in line just like people. Timing was everything. You learned to be efficient, not to waste a minute of heat, not to linger too long at the sink. There were labels on everything, jars of salt, tins of tea, even sponges, and dish rags were marked. One family might use dish soap in an old vodka bottle, another a block of solid laundry soap. To mistake one for the other even once could trigger a cold war of glances and slammed cupboard doors. The bathroom was shared too, not just the toilet but the bathtub, the mirror, the space to breathe. Morning routines were choreographed. With silent precision, someone knocked softly to signal their turn. Someone else brushed their teeth at the kitchen sink to avoid the wait. A mother washed her child in a plastic basin because the line for the tub was too long. Everyone adjusted. Everyone endured. Arguments were frequent, over noise, over smells, over the length of time someone took at the stove. But so were quiet gestures, someone leaving extra tea in the pot, or passing down a jar of soup to a sick neighbor. It was a strange intimacy. You knew when the woman in room 3 had a visitor. You knew when the young man in room 5 got bad news in the mail. You knew when the child upstairs took her first steps. Because you could hear the delighted gasps echo through the paper-thin walls. The sounds were constant, water running, coughing, laughter, a radio playing 2 rooms away. You learned to live in a kind of gentle noise, to tune it out when needed, to accept that your story was always being written next to someone else's. And yet, despite the chaos, these spaces were often the first homes many families had. After war, after evacuation, after dislocation, the communalka was not luxury, but it was shelter, and sometimes more than that. Because in such closeness, a strange solidarity formed. You knew the habits of those around you better than you knew your own cousins. You helped when someone fell. You lent sugar when it was scarce. You watched each other's children, not out of kindness always, sometimes just out of necessity. But over time, even necessity became familiarity, and familiarity, over long winters and hard summers, became a kind of love. The children didn't notice the lack of privacy. They shared toys, invented games in the stairwell, borrowed crayons from room to room. A door was never truly closed. The hallway was their playground, the kitchen their classroom. They learned to whisper secrets in corners, to trade pieces of candy for glimpses at hidden magazines, to build friendships from proximity and patience. Celebrations, when they happened, were communal too. A wedding meant all rooms prepared something. A jar of pickled mushrooms, a plate of cold potatoes, a borrowed radio speaker to play music for dancing. Tables were pushed together, chairs dragged from every room. For one night, the walls fell away, and everyone became part of the same story. But the next morning, the kitchen would be crowded again. Someone would grumble about spilled juice. Someone else would clean it up without a word. Life resumed. For outsiders, the communalka could seem suffocating, but for those inside, it was simply life. One did not dwell on what was missing. One lived in what was there, and somehow, in those narrow kitchens and crowded bedrooms, people created entire lives. They married, raised children, studied, sewed, cooked, wept, and laughed, often all in the same day, all in the same room. Even now, long after many of these apartments have been renovated or abandoned, those who lived there remember not just the inconveniences, but the warmth, the closeness, the smell of fried onions that always signaled dinner time. The feel of the waiting was quiet mostly. People brought newspapers. Knitting children, they stood in silence or whispered under their breath. There was always someone keeping track. Who's last in line? They asked, and someone would nod or raise a hand slightly. That was how order was kept. No need for barriers or signs. Just trust, or at least the shared agreement that waiting had rules. And the queue moved like breath. Inhale. A few steps forward. Exhale. Pause. Long enough to stamp your feet in the snow or shift your bag from one shoulder to the other. It was a rhythm learned from youth, passed down through generations. Children knew it. Elders perfected it. Everyone belonged to it. There was something both exhausting and intimate in the queue. You stood beside strangers for hours, yet left, knowing more about them than you did about some friends. You learned their stories, their complaints, their methods of stretching a ruble. You heard confessions in murmured tones about a son who drank too much, a husband sent to work in a distant town, a daughter who hoped to study theater. in a system that discouraged free speech. The line became a place of quiet honesty. You learned to read the signs. If someone had a cart, they expected a large item. If someone carried a jar, it might be for Jan. If they clutched ration coupons in a gloved hand, it could mean meat. You asked cautiously. You whispered, because rumors spread like frost. There, selling real butter at the corner store. Tights, black ones, came in this morning. Bananas, I swear, real bananas. Often, it wasn't true, but even the rumor had power. It pulled people into motion. And once they arrived, even if nothing remained, they stayed, because perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next week, the line might return. In summer, people waited under the sun, shielding their eyes, shifting from foot to foot on hot pavement. In winter, they wore layers, stamping their boots to keep circulation, scarves wrapped twice, sometimes 3 times around their necks. A thermos of tea helped. A thick novel. Someone always had a thermos. Some lines lasted an hour, some an entire day, for appliances, for a television, a washing machine, a refrigerator. The wait could span months, not standing. Of course, you added your name to a list, and the list sat on a desk in a gray office with fluorescent lights and overworked clerks. You returned every few weeks to check your place, to ask, soon, and be told, not yet, and still you waited. When your turn came, when you finally reached the counter or the window or the edge of the stall, it was rarely dramatic. There was no cheering, no music, no fanfare. Just a nod, an exchange of rubles, the slow, careful placing of the item into your bag. It was almost anticlimactic, but still, you carried it like treasure, because in that moment, you had something others did not. Back home, whatever it was, a head of cabbage, a pair of shoes, a tin of sprats, was met with reverence. Children gathered to touch it, neighbors peeked in to ask if the line was still going. You said, I heard it's done, and they nodded knowingly. That was enough. Sometimes, people bartered what they found, traded half a kilo of sausage for sugar, or sold items for a small profit. Sometimes, they gave a little away, a handful of mandarins to a teacher, a scarf to a cousin, because they remembered the waiting, and because they knew another line would come. Evenings in the Soviet Union often held stories of the day's queue. Over tea, people would recount how long it had been, how cold it was, who was rude, who was kind, who slipped in from the side and was scolded by a grandmother with sharp elbows and sharper words. These stories were part of the daily rhythm, shared with pride, with frustration, with weary amusement. In the queue, there was hardship, but also dignity. People stood, they endured, and they did it with grace, not always joyfully, but with patience born from knowing there was no other way. To live in the Soviet Union was to know waiting. It was stitched into the calendar, baked into the bread, layered between morning and night. It was a kind of silence, a stillness, a test. And though the lines are mostly gone now, those who lived them remember, not always with fondness, but with a strange, quiet pride, because they learned, in the cold, in the dust, in the hum of fluorescent light above a government store counter, that sometimes the most ordinary moments become the ones that shape us most. To grow up in the shadow of red banners and warm mittens, where ideology and innocence walked hand in hand. Childhood in the Soviet Union was not framed by cartoons or cereal boxes or candy aisles. It was shaped by something quieter, something sturdier. It was shaped by walls that carried the scent of stewed cabbage and drying laundry, by books with stiff pages and blunt illustrations, by small woolen mittens tied to the sleeves of coats, and always by the quiet presence of Lenin. He was everywhere. His portrait, solemn and still, hung in schools, libraries, factories, even kindergartens, sometimes framed in gold, sometimes taped to a wall beside hand-drawn posters. His eyes gazed out steadily, high above the children stacking blocks or reciting poems. He wasn't feared. He wasn't even questioned. He was simply there, a part of the room, like the radiator or the clock. You did not wonder why. He just was, for a Soviet child. The world was both large and small, large in that it carried the weight of an enormous country with vast fields, strange cities, mountains and oceans and borders that were both distant and invisible. Small because daily life rotated around the familiar, the neighborhood, the apartment courtyard, the hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom. Toys were simple, wooden blocks, rag dolls. Cars made of metal that chipped with time, a ball, skipping rope, a plastic harmonica that rarely stayed in tune, paper dolls cut from old magazines, games played with bottle caps or string. There was creativity in scarcity. You made do. You imagined the playgrounds were made of iron and cement, climbing frames shaped like rockets, swings that creaked with rust. In summer, the metal burned your hands. In winter, it bit through your gloves. But it was yours. The courtyard became a kingdom, the snowbanks, a fortress, the trees, towers. Children ran through it with red cheeks and woolen hats pulled low, their scarves wrapped too tightly by anxious grandmothers. School began early, at 7, sometimes 6. Each morning, you lined up, neatly, silently, a red pioneer scarf knotted carefully around your neck, your satchel packed with lined notebooks, a pencil case, and a thermos of weak tea. The classroom smelled of chalk and wax paper. The walls were covered with maps and rules and portraits of famous revolutionaries. The windows let in a pale, watery light, and in winter, you kept your coat on for the first hour of the day. Teachers were stern but fair. They taught not just reading and writing, but posture, discipline, loyalty. You memorized poems about tractors and peace. You drew 5-pointed stars and colored them carefully in red. You stood and recited. You sat and copied. You were part of something. You were told often how lucky you were to live in this country, this vast, powerful place where workers ruled and peace was the goal. And in many ways, it felt true. There was pride in the air, pride in the accomplishments, the first man in space, the strength of the Red Army, the bravery of those who fought in the Great Patriotic War. Children were taught to look forward, to serve, to work hard, to believe. But beneath the slogans, childhood also had its own quiet language. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner, the feel of your mother's whereupon scarf pulled up over your nose, the rattle of the tram, the way your shoes squeaked on the polished floor of the school hallway, the hush of snow falling against the window during afternoon lessons. At home, you did not have a room of your own. Perhaps a corner of the living room, a desk by the radiator, a shared drawer for your notebooks, a few books, fairy tales from Russia and beyond, bound in faded covers. If your family had a television, you might sit on the floor to watch cartoons from Czechoslovakia or puppet shows from Moscow. You didn't always understand them, but they were colorful, and they were yours. Your grandparents told stories of war, your parents of work. You listened with wide eyes, but didn't always grasp the meaning. You lived in a space between history and hope, between slogans on the classroom wall and the warmth of your father's arm as you walked home. Together, in the dusk. And on holidays, real holidays, there was joy. On New Year's Eve, the apartment was decorated with tinsel and a tree, not for Christmas. That wasn't allowed, but for the new year. Grandfather Frost came dressed in blue or red, and he brought sweets and small gifts you might receive. The classroom, the front of the book, the badge on your scarf. You did not fear him. You simply understood this was your world. He was part of it. Years later, some children would remember those days as harsh, others as warm, most as both, but all would remember them. Because childhood in the Soviet Union was like the lines on a well-used hand, etched, unchanging, uniquely yours. And if you asked, decades later, what it was like, many would smile softly and say only this: it was cold, it was full, was home. Where discipline and dust mixed with chalk and childhood And each morning began with a line, a song, and a quiet obedience. Each day began early, not with excitement, not with dread, just with routine. You walked before the sun, especially in winter, when darkness lingered long past morning. The apartment was still cold, the air sharp as you pulled on your tights, your shirt, your uniform. Brown or navy, starched collars, stiff fabric that resisted motion but encouraged posture. The red pioneer scarf came last, folded carefully into a triangle, knotted neatly at the front. It was more than cloth, it was belonging, proof that you were one of many, one of millions, a child of the motherland. Your school bag was square, often heavy, always plain. Inside were notebooks lined in thin blue grids, pens with metal nibs, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, bread, mostly, maybe cheese, if it was a good day, maybe a boiled egg. You tucked it carefully beside your textbooks, mathematics, history, Russian language, and slung the bag over your shoulder. The school building waited like a stone ship in the cold, flat-roofed, rectangular, with wide windows that collected. So, the paint was faded, but the brass plaque by the door gleamed. Number 42, number 15, number 86. Each school was a number, not a name, something solid, something unchangeable. You lined up outside with the others, row by row, still sleepy, scarf ends fluttering in the wind. The teacher came out, clipboard in hand, coat buttoned to the neck. She called your names. You answered, loud and clear, no smiles yet. That would come later, maybe. For now discipline was the morning's only language. Inside, the air was warmer but stale, the smell of varnished floors, wet coats, and dust. You hung your coat in the cloakroom, changed into school shoes, and marched to your classroom. Not ran, marched, quietly, in twos, because that was the rule. The classroom was simple, wooden desks, a chalkboard, a bust of Lenin in the corner, his gaze always slightly turned to the left, a large portrait of him above the board, next to the red flag with the gold star, and hammer and sickle. Above that, a slogan, study, 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 the words of Lenin himself. You sat in assigned seats. You stood when the teacher entered. Good morning, comrade teacher, you said in unison. And then the day began. First, the national anthem, played on a crackling loudspeaker in every room of the school. You stood, straight-backed, staring forward, not because you always understood the words, but because they were the words. Then came arithmetic, long division, geometry. You copied equations from the board in silence, your pencil tapping rhythmically against the desk. There were no calculators, no colored markers, no distractions, only numbers, and the rustle of pages turning. Mistakes were corrected in red ink. Success was met with nods, not praise. A red check, a star, a line drawn beneath a heading, enough to show you had done your part. After math came literature. You read aloud from Tolstoy or Pushkin. You memorized poems and stood to recite them. Sometimes you stumbled, sometimes you forgot. The teacher rarely raised her voice, but her silence could be sharp enough. You learned to listen, to speak only when spoken to raise your hand with fingers pressed tightly together. History followed, not just events, but purpose, names of heroes, battles won, achievements celebrated. You learned dates by heart. You copied maps. You drew red arrows across continents, tracing the path of Soviet triumph. You learned which questions to ask, and which not to. Recess was short. You ate your sandwich. You shared it, sometimes. You drank your tea from a metal cup, steaming faintly in the cold hallway. You played outside if the weather allowed, in the courtyard, beneath the bare branches of the schoolyard trees. You ran in stiff coats and heavy boots. You chased each other, laughed briefly, returned to the building with red cheeks and damp mittens. Then came music, or art, or a lesson on proper hygiene. Sometimes a film, sometimes a health check, where you stood in your underclothes while the nurse weighed you, measured you, marked your height in a logbook. You were a body in a system, growing, monitored, shaped. Before dismissal, there was a short meeting of the pioneer group. A student gave a report, another read a poem, the teacher reminded you of tomorrow's assignment. And always you sang, not loudly, not joyfully, but as expected, songs of work, of progress, of peace. You went home tired, not from play, but from structure, from stillness, from the effort of being good. You trudged through snow or rain, satchels banging against your leg, scarf loosened finally. Home meant warmth. A bowl of soup, a quiet corner to do your homework, a radio playing softly in the kitchen, your grandmother stirring buckwheat on the stove. You told her what you learned. She nodded, her eyes tired but proud. You laid out your clothes for the next day, folded your scarf, packed your bag, and as night came, you looked once more at your school books, not out of fear, but because you had been taught that learning was the path forward, the duty, the gift, the way to serve the country and make your family proud. And so it went, day after day, a rhythm you didn't question, a routine you didn't break. And even now, years later, that rhythm stays with you. The smell of chalk, the weight of that red scarf, the sound of boots echoing in the corridor. A Soviet school day wasn't loud, it wasn't bright, but it was solid, predictable. It held you, shaped you, quieted you. It was a day like any other. And yet, it was everything. Not just where food was made, but where truth simmered, where voices softened, and life unfolded one cup of tea at a time. In the Soviet home, the kitchen was more than a room. It was more than cabinets, tiles, and a stove. It was a sanctuary, a confessional, a war room, a quiet theater of life, while the living room was for guests, and the hallway for shoes. The kitchen, always small, always full, was where everything real happened. It began with the hum of the gas flame, the soft hiss as the match lit, the blue flicker beneath the dented kettle. Then came the scent, not rich, not indulgent, but honest. Cabbage boiling, potatoes frying, buckwheat toasting, in butter, sour cream bubbling gently in a pan. These smells didn't just signal food, they signaled presence, that someone was home, that someone was trying, that the day, no matter how hard, still ended with warmth. The table was never large, often only room for 2 chairs, maybe 3 squeezed in. Sometimes it folded out from the wall. Sometimes it was covered in a plastic cloth with faded flowers. On it, a sugar bowl, a tin of tea, maybe a plate with sliced bread and cucumbers. Everything was arranged not for style, but for habit. The butter dish had a lid. The salt was in a small jar. The spoons had dents, but they worked. You did not sit at the kitchen table casually. It was an invitation, a conversation, an unspoken agreement that something needed to be said. Or sometimes that nothing needed to be said at all, only shared. People talked in the kitchen differently than anywhere else. Voices softened, postures relaxed. In the kitchen, you could speak your mind carefully, always carefully, but with more freedom than in the living room, where the onion still watched from the wall. In the kitchen, mothers sat late into the night, knitting in one hand, a glass of black tea in the other. Fathers cleaned their nails with pocket knives, while enough, because tea meant welcome, tea meant warmth, tea meant stay, speak, rest. In apartments where walls were thin and secrets dangerous, the kitchen was the one place you could exhale. The one room where the state side did not follow you, or at least not so closely. People whispered truths over their cups. They folded newspapers carefully, discussed what was read between the lines. They questioned the headlines, then fell silent when someone knocked at the door. There were laughs, too, loud ones even. Someone would remember a story, a joke from work, a mishap at the store, a memory from the army. They'd slap the table, wipe their eyes, and pour another glass, not of tea this time, something stronger, from a bottle hidden behind the flour tin, just a little, for warmth, for company. The kitchen absorbed it all. It was never tidy for long. There were always crumbs, always dishes drying by the sink, always a jar of something fermenting quietly in the corner. But no one minded. It was a working room, a living room in the truest sense. In the early mornings, the kitchen belonged to mothers. But first, stirring porridge, ironing school shirts on the table, wrapping sandwiches in brown paper. In the afternoons, it belonged to children, their elbows on the table, their homework spread out, their pencils scratching lines into rough paper. And in the evenings, it belonged to everyone. That was when the true talk began, when time slowed, when the lights dimmed. Many people remember the Soviet kitchen more vividly than any other room. The way the faucet squeaked, the pattern of the oilcloth, the rattle of the window pane in the wind, the creak of the stool that no one could fix, the taste of slightly overboiled tea, the comfort of hands wrapped around a warm glass. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't spacious, it wasn't stylish, but it was sacred. Because in a world where so much felt heavy, where choices were few and caution was constant, the kitchen was a place of light, a soft, flickering light that came not from a chandelier, but from the stove, from the candle lit when the power went out, from the eyes across the table, meeting yours over the steam of the kettle, a place where love was not declared but demonstrated. One spoon of sugar, one crust of bread, one careful question. So much of Soviet life happened out there, in the factory, in the queue, in the office, under the watch of the system. But the soul of it, the human part, it lived here, between pots and cups, between laughter and silence, between the tick of the wall clock and the warmth of the kettle. Here in the kitchen. Always in the kitchen, mothers, workers, wives, comrades, the women who held the weight of the everyday with quiet strength and unspoken grace rose before the sun. Always, in the cold months, that meant stepping into darkness. In the warm ones, it meant the faint blue glow of early morning. Her day began not with time for herself, but with duty to her children, to her job, to her home, and behind all of that, always, to the country. A Soviet woman carried many names: Mama, Babushka, comrade, citizen, worker, heroine. The state celebrated her, glorified her in posters and textbooks, told stories of her bravery during the war, her productivity in the fields, her wisdom as a mother. She was shown holding grain, raising flags, comforting children, building cities, and in some ways, these depictions were true. She did do all of that, just without the spotlight, without the trumpet. At home, she did everything. She cooked, often without enough. She sewed, often without new fabric. She patched shoes, boiled laundry, managed the budget with precision a mathematician would envy. She stretched rubles across weeks, turned scraps into dinner, turned empty shelves into meals. It wasn't magic. It was will. She worked, too, because she had to, because nearly every woman worked, in factories, hospitals, schools, as engineers, cleaners, chemists, clerks. She stood on assembly lines with swollen feet. She taught children with 20 eyes on her and not enough chalk. She tended to patients with no gloves and too few bandages. She returned home exhausted, not just in body, but in soul, and still her work was not done. She cleaned, cooked, listened, encouraged, disciplined, held. She stood in queues for hours to bring home a kilo of flour. She walked home in icy wind because the bus was too full. She stayed up late sewing a child's costume for a school play. She ironed her husband's shirt while the kettle boiled. She read, sometimes, but usually only after everyone else had gone to bed. She was rarely alone, but rarely seen. The state gave her medals, occasionally, for motherhood, for productivity, for loyalty. She accepted them with quiet dignity. She pinned them to her coat, wore them to parades. But the real medals, the ones she never received, were for everything unseen, for not breaking, for not shouting, for loving anyway. And yes, she loved, even when tired, even when disappointed, even when angry at the system that promised so much and delivered so little. Her love came in folded laundry, in warm soup, in the way she tucked the scarf tighter around your neck before you left for school, In the way she saved the last sugar cube for you. Her strength was quiet but relentless. She did not wait for praise. She did not expect help. She simply moved forward, always forward, as if pulled by some invisible rope of responsibility that she never questioned, only held onto. Sometimes she laughed, loudly, fully, over a glass of tea with a neighbor, at a joke told after too much vodka, at a memory from school days when she ran barefoot through summer fields and dreamed of being a pilot. Those moments mattered. They were flashes of her true self, the girl inside the woman. Still there, still dreaming. She aged quickly. The lines on her face came early, not from vanity denied, but from burden carried. Her hands grew rough from soap and cold and work, but her eyes stayed sharp, watching everything, missing nothing. She went to meetings. She voted. She paid her dues, not always with belief, but with discipline, with endurance. She read Pravda because she was expected to, but her truths came from experience, from what she saw, from what she knew that couldn't be written. Some women pushed further. They became leaders, factory heads, directors, politicians, but most stayed in the middle, the quiet backbone of the country, the ones who made sure the morning began, the children ate, the fires stayed lit. She rarely rested. Her vacations were spent standing in more lines, traveling to crowded sanatoriums, or tending to her elderly mother. She shared beds with children, rooms with in-laws, frustrations with no one but the mirror. But she endured. Through shortages, through blackouts, through winters that seemed never to end, through silence, through grief, through routine, and somehow she carried softness too, in the way she combed her daughter's hair, in the songs she sang while scrubbing the floor, in the old photographs she tucked inside a drawer, in the tiny handkerchief she always kept in her coat pocket, just in case you might pass her on the street and not notice her. Her coat was plain, her walk purposeful, but if you looked closely, at the way she held her bag, at the way she wrapped a scarf around a child's chin, at the way she stood still in the queue without complaint, you'd see it. The quiet heroism, the unshakable strength, the woman of the red banner, not because she waved it, but because she bore its weight every single day, a life shaped by promises and permissions, where everything came from the state and everything could be taken back. To live in the Soviet Union was to live with the state as a silent partner. All things. It was there when you were born, in the hospital with metal beds and pale green walls. The relationship was not violent, not to most. It was bureaucratic. It was dull, and that was its power. You applied for things. Everything had a form, a line, a stamp. You wrote petitions. You waited for approvals. You submitted documents in triplicate. You carried your passport, not the kind that let you leave the country, but the internal one, the one that told the state where you lived, where you worked, what you were allowed to do. You asked permission to move, to marry, to attend university, to receive goods, to travel to another city, even within your own country. Some permissions were automatic, others were mysterious. Denials came with no explanation, approvals with no celebration. You learned not to question. You learned to nod. If you complained quietly, in the kitchen, with the window shut. You learned to speak in layers, to say one thing and mean another, to trust carefully, to watch what you wrote in letters, to leave out names, just in case, because though the state gave, it also listened. It had ears in factories, in schools and apartment blocks. Sometimes in your own family, informers didn't wear uniforms. They were neighbors, colleagues, friends, not always by choice, sometimes out of fear, sometimes for favors, sometimes for nothing at all. One careless joke, one sarcastic comment, one letter intercepted, and suddenly things disappeared. A job, a place at university, a travel permit, a future, sometimes a person, and no one would say why. They just weren't there anymore. You learned to explain these absences with silence, but even in fear there was order. There was a sense of security, strange as it sounds. You knew what you had, you knew what to expect. The salary might be small, but it came. The apartment might be crumbling, but it was yours. The state might be cold, but it was consistent. And, for many, that was enough, because the state was also the parent of a country that had seen too much loss, too much hunger, too much war. It provided, in a world with few choices. The ones it offered were stable. You did not shop freely, but you did not starve. You did not travel far, but you had a home. You did not question publicly, but you belonged. The trade-off was invisible, like air pressure, always present, hard to name. And so people lived in the spaces between what was said and what was known. They decorated their apartments with what they had. They studied hard. They raised children to be careful and clever. They read between the lines of the newspaper. They watched television not for truth, but for rhythm. They adapted. They knew what was allowed and what was not. And yet, despite all this, there were moments, small, quiet ones, where the weight lifted, where a song played that wasn't on the approved list, where a novel passed from hand to hand, copied by candlelight, where laughter rose too loud at a kitchen table and no one silenced it, where a birthday was celebrated not with gifts, but with presents. The state could not control these. It tried. But there are places within people that cannot be registered, cannot be filed, cannot be punished. Those spaces are where the truth lived, where memory settled. Because even if the state gave everything, even if it built the school, paid the salary, printed the book, issued the ration card, life itself did not belong to it, not entirely. And in the end, it was not the slogans or parades that people remembered most. It was the things the state could never give and never quite take away. In a world of watchful silence, it was over tea that truth came out quietly, cautiously, but deeply felt. It was never planned. The truth, when it arrived, came not with a shout but with a murmur, a tilt of the head, a glance toward the door to check if it was closed, a hand resting on the side of a teacup just a moment too long. That was how it always began, a cup of tea, a shared moment, and then a truth whispered, offered like contraband, like something sacred. In the Soviet Union, the most honest conversations didn't happen in offices or assemblies. They didn't happen at podiums, or behind the pages of Pravda, or in the shadow of red flags. They happened in kitchens, in cramped spaces with scratched tables, with wallpaper faded from steam and time, spaces that smelled of tea and sugar and memory. Two people would sit, sometimes three, a pot between them, the glasses slightly fogged, the kettle still warm, perhaps a small dish of jam, or a plate with a heel of dark bread, nothing extravagant, just enough to say, "I've made space for you." And then, slowly, the edges of the conversation would begin to soften, the scripted lines would fall away. The weather, the price of potatoes, the cousin in Tashkent, the teacher with the loud voice, all said first, rehearsed, safe. Then silence. And in that silence, someone might lean in just slightly. Someone might say, "Did you hear what happened to Victor?" Or, "I read something in a foreign magazine." Just a sentence. Or even, just, "Do you ever wonder if it's really as they say?" And the air would change, not with fear exactly, but with alertness, a hush that came not from volume, but from intent. These whispers were not meant to overthrow governments or change history. They were smaller than that, and more human. They were moments of recognition, moments where people allowed themselves to wonder, to question, to ache, because beneath the surface of daily life, beneath the pioneer meetings and factory quotas and approved newsreels, there lived a different kind of truth, a personal one, a fragile one that couldn't survive in the open air. So it found its home in the quiet. In tea glasses held with both hands, in windows steamed from the inside, in the rustle of a coat left draped over the back of a kitchen chair, meaning someone intended to stay a while. Sometimes the truth was just a memory. My grandfather was taken in 1937. My sister applied for university. and didn't get in, but the official's daughter did. I remember when there were bananas once in Leningrad. I think I was 6. Other times, it was a feeling. I don't believe everything they say. Do you ever feel like we're pretending? I love this country, but sometimes I don't recognize it. These were not radical statements, not by the standards of history, but in the context of the time. They were brave, because to speak against the silence even in a whisper was to declare that something inside you still belonged to you, that your thoughts were not entirely state property. Of course, the risks were real. Everyone knew stories. A neighbor who said too much, a writer who vanished, a teacher quietly reassigned. The walls were thin, phones sometimes clicked. You never knew which name might be written down. So people became careful, skilled. They developed the language of suggestion. Raised eyebrow, a half-finished sentence, a pause that said more than any word. They didn't need to explain. They only needed to share the silence that followed, and somehow, in those small moments, something else happened to connection, a closeness deeper than politics, to people sharing not just words, but vulnerability, not rebellion, but recognition. It was in those conversations that real relationships were forged, friendships that lasted lifetimes, bonds formed not by shared interests, but by shared truths. And all the while, the tea cooled in its glass. Outside, the streets remained quiet. The snow continued to fall. The television droned in the other room. But in the kitchen, beneath a single overhead bulb, something stirred, something that could not be found in newspapers or party speeches. Honesty, tenderness, quiet defiance. And when the conversation ended, no one said what had been said. No one wrote it down. They washed the glasses. They folded the napkin. They opened the window to let in the cold, but the warmth stayed, long after the tea had been drunk, long after the guest had left, long after the last word had been whispered, because the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, even in a whisper, especially in a whisper. In a world of careful speech and measured lives, it was music smuggled, borrowed, whispered through walls that let the soul breatheth. Buildings were silent on the outside. Rows of identical windows, curtains drawn, radios low. But behind those walls, in the private corners of thousands of apartments, there was music, not always loud, not always legal, but always there. It hummed beneath the surface of things, softly defiant, quietly alive. Music in the Soviet Union was more than sound. It was a current beneath the words people were expected to say. It was a form of travel in a land where borders were sealed, a secret language, a comfort, a risk, a prayer. The official music was everywhere. Marches, anthems, patriotic choirs, state-approved composers. The voice of the people, harmonized for order. It blared from loudspeakers in parks, from parade floats, from early morning broadcasts. The red banner waved, and the brass bands played, and yet the people listened to something else. They listened behind closed doors, in bedrooms with locked windows, in basements, in attics, on vinyl discs passed hand to hand, copied on reel-to-reel tape machines, sometimes even scratched onto discarded X-ray film. The so-called bone records, ghostly images of rib cages pressed with forbidden melodies, a fusion of the body and the beat. What did they listen to? Sometimes it was the haunting voice of Vladimir Vysotsky, raw, poetic, cracked, like an old door hinge. He sang of prisoners, of soldiers, of everyday people. He sang what others could not say. His records weren't sold in shops, but everyone had one, or knew someone who did. Sometimes it was Bullet Java, his guitar strumming like rain against a window pane, songs about love, doubt, memory, not protests, never directly, but reflections that gently asked questions the system never answered. And sometimes it was even more dangerous. Jazz, rock, the Beatles, the forbidden rhythms of The West, smuggled in from abroad, copied with hissing fidelity, passed down like relics. To own a Beatles tape wasn't just about liking the music, it was about wanting to feel something freer, something beyond the walls. Teenagers played these songs in secret. They gathered in friends' apartments, dimming the lights, turning the volume just loud enough to hear but not loud enough to draw attention. They swayed in small, awkward dances. They didn't always understand the lyrics, but they felt them. And parents, those who had known war, rationing, obedience, sometimes sat in the next room, saying nothing. They didn't always approve, but sometimes they smiled softly, because once they too had found their freedom in a different kind of song. There were concerts, yes, official ones, grand halls, symphony orchestras, state singers in glittering dresses, the kind of music that praised harvests and cosmonauts and factory workers. It was good music, well made, technically perfect, but it didn't always reach the heart. The music that did, the music that people remembered, was quieter, played on an old guitar, its wood-worn smooth, sung by someone you knew in a circle of friends, or piped through a single earphone late at night, under a blanket, as the snow tapped the window pane. Sometimes music was born at home, a father teaching his daughter a folk song from his village, a grandmother humming a lullaby from before the war, a boy tapping rhythms on a school desk, dreaming of drums he'd never owned. These were not performances. They were offerings, ways to carry emotion where words failed, ways to say, I feel, I remember, I hoped. Because in the controlled quiet of Soviet life, where words were measured and opinions often guarded, music could still stretch its arms wide. And when the song ended, when the tape clicked, when the needle lifted, there was a silence that felt like reverence, not absence, not emptiness, but the echo of something real. People didn't always clap, there was no audience, but they remembered. They copied the lyrics into notebooks. They sang softly while walking home from work. They held those melodies in their breath. Even now, years later, those songs live on, not on concert stages, but in kitchens, in stairwells, and the low hum of a radio tune just off frequency. Because music in the Soviet Union was never just entertainment. It was memory. It was longing. It was truth, soft enough to whisper, strong enough to survive, where scarcity shaped the shelves, where lines formed before dawn, and where desire had to learn. Shadow shop in the Soviet Union was never simply to buy, was not a task of selection, of wandering down bright aisles with music in the air. It was not a matter of choosing between brands, colors, or styles. Shopping for most was an act of navigation, a test of endurance, a negotiation with uncertainty. You did not shop for what you wanted. You shopped for what was there. The shops themselves, called magazines, were plain, utilitarian, white tile floors, gray walls, long counters, no music, no advertising, no welcoming warmth, a few posters, usually faded, promoting state achievements or encouraging thrift, rows of shelves, mostly half full, sometimes nearly empty. Each shop had a specific category: bread, dairy, meat, clothing, books. There were no supermarkets, no all-in-one places. Each item came with its own building, its own system, its own line. Lines were the lifeblood of shopping. You saw one from across the street and joined it instinctively, not knowing what it led to. A whisper passed down the line: they have oranges, or butter came in this morning, or sometimes just something's there. You waited for minutes, for hours, in rain and snow. In the heat of August, you stood with others, rubbing your hands for warmth, shifting your weight. Mothers with strollers, pensioners in heavy coats, teenagers sent by their parents. No one complained aloud. What was the point inside? The process was formal. You did not touch the goods. There were glass cases. You pointed. You gave your coupon or ration card if one was needed. You paid the clerk. You took a slip. You waited again. You took the item. There was no browsing, no testing, no sampling. The choices were few, often Only one kind of sausage, one kind of bread, milk in glass bottles, sometimes sour, cheese wrapped in brown paper, eggs in twine-tied cartons, apples with bruises, potatoes with dirt still clinging, sugar in white sacks when available, salt in small blue boxes that lasted forever. Clothing shops were no better, rows of the same gloss, the same shoes, into sizes too large or too small, coats that fit no one quite right. You bought what you found and made it work. You tailored it yourself, or you traded with a neighbor, or you simply wore what you had for another year. And yet, when something rare appeared, something bright, something new, the city pulsed with rumor. Imported bananas, nylon stockings, polished perfume, check shoes. People ran across courtyards, made calls from public phones, whispered, "They have it," but only until noon. These were the small excitements, the quiet victories. To bring home a tin of pineapple was to win the lottery. To buy a liter of real orange juice was to become a legend in your stairwell. To find a doll with painted lashes or a plastic toy truck was to watch your child's face bloom with a kind of rare, gentle awe. There were spec shops, two specialty stores for those with connections or hard currency, closed to most, windows covered, goods inside that few would ever touch, imported chocolates, foreign razors, real coffee. But those places were other worlds. You passed them without stopping. They were not for you. Books were their own kind of ration. Popular titles disappeared quickly. People formed waiting lists. At the library, they copied entire novels by hand. They traded second-hand paperbacks like treasure. A volume of Pushkin or Tolstoy, bound. And when you came home with a loaf still warm, with a wedge of cheese, with a tin of condensed milk, you held it carefully, not just for its taste, but for its meaning. A reminder that effort mattered, that waiting had purpose, that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the shelves were not empty. And in a country of scarcity, that was enough to keep going, where the air smelled of dill and soil, where tomatoes grew under watchful hands, and where freedom came in rows of green when the snow melted and the trees began to soften into green, when the trams carried the scent of fall earth and open windows. Something stirred in people, a quiet call, not loud but certain. It was time for the dacha. The dacha was not a luxury, it was a necessity, not for comfort, but for something older, simpler, and far more essential: space, soil, silence, a plot of land, a few meters to call your own. They were small, always small, wooden cabins, some no bigger than a single room, no plumbing, no electricity. Sometimes the roof might leak, the door might stick, the floorboards creak with every step, but it didn't matter. It was yours. You left the city behind, the noise, the concrete, the grayness, and you stepped into green. Getting there was a journey in itself. A crowded train packed with families and sacks of potatoes, the scent of boiled eggs and pickles. Conversations held over shared benches, everyone heading somewhere off the map too. A line of wooden houses with small gardens and tin roofs that reflected the summer sun. You arrived with bags heavy, but heart light. You opened the shutters, swept out the dust, breathed in the musty scent of last year's summer, still clinging to the curtains. You unpacked the enamel mugs, the checkered tablecloth, the jar of salt, and then you went outside. There, the land waited up. The garden was the dacha's heart, not ornamental, not decorative, but purposeful. You planted, you watered, you weeded rows of cucumbers, of tomatoes, of beets, currant bushes along the fence, dill, always dill, a child's hands gently patting down the soil. A grandmother crouched low, whispering to the carrots that there was no rush. The garden did not ask for speed, it asked for presence. You bent to its rhythm. You woke early, pulled on your rubber boots, stepped into dew-covered grass. The earth was cool, generous, forgiving. You gave it your time, your back, your hope. It gave you food, meaning, quiet. The fences were wooden, slightly crooked. Some were painted, some bare. They divided one plot from the next, but never entirely. Neighbors leaned across them, exchanged advice, traded seedlings, borrowed tools. Gossip passed between tomato rows. News was shared beside buckets. The dacha community was its own world, full of unspoken rules and gentle rituals. Inside the cabin, things were simple: a table, a cot, a gas burner. If you were lucky, you cooked. Outside, mostly, soup made with garden herbs, potatoes pulled from the soil that morning, bread bought from the nearby village kiosk, tea brewed over a small fire, served in metal cups. It all tasted better here, fresher, realer. Children ran barefoot, caught bugs, built forts from sticks, slept in hammocks or under thin blankets, lulled by the chirp of crickets and the rustle of birch leaves. They knew not to step on the cucumbers. They knew to water the beans before lunch. They knew the names of flowers, the difference between weeds and crops, the taste of warm strawberries picked straight from the vine. And the adults, they worked, yes, but they also rested. Sat in plastic chairs with their legs stretched out, hats shading their faces. They played cards, read books, mended shirts. They watched clouds. They remembered things they hadn't thought of in years. The dacha slowed time. There were no parades here, no slogans, no meetings. The state faded into the background, blurred by sun and bees. No one gave orders in the garden. The plants grew how they pleased, and in tending to them, people reclaimed a part of themselves not governed by permits or plans. Evenings were golden. The light lingered long, casting long shadows across the dirt paths. The air cooled. You lit a small fire, wrapped yourself in a sweater, sat on the steps, listened. A neighbor's radio in the distance, the hum of insects, the clink of a tea glass being set down, laughter drifting like smoke. In that hour, nothing more was needed. The summer passed slowly, and then it ended. You packed the jars of pickles, of jam, of marinated mushrooms. You closed the shutters, swept the floor, locked the door with its rusty key. Took one last look at the garden now empty, resting. You returned to the city with hands stained from earth and a bag full of harvest. You returned not richer, not in money, but restored. The dacha gave you no luxury, but it gave you space, and in a life where so little was truly yours, that space meant everything. Even now, people remember the smell of dill in the morning, the soft feel of soil between their fingers, the creak of the gate, the warmth of a sun-warmed tomato, eaten, standing in the garden. The dacha was never just a place. It was freedom, and rows of green, when the factories paused and the banners rose, when songs played from loudspeakers and everyone knew how to march, to wave, to celebrate together, even if no one quite knew why. In the Soviet Union, holidays were not a private affair. They were not marked by individual traditions or spontaneous celebrations. They arrived with schedule and structure, with ceremony and choreography. They were loud, they were public, and they belonged to everyone because they were meant for everyone. When a Soviet holiday came, you felt it not just in the calendar, but in the streets. The year changed. You saw it in the red flags suddenly hung from every balcony, in the fresh paint applied to benches and fences, in the whitewashed tree trunks that lined the boulevards like lines on a page. You saw it in the crisp uniforms pulled from closets, ironed, pinned with medals. You heard it in the voice from the loudspeaker outside the local house of culture, a martial tune, a march, a familiar patriotic song echoing through the morning air. May Day, Victory Day, Revolution Day, Lenin's birthday, each with its own rituals, each with its banners, each with its slogans, each with its meaning, official, repeated, memorized. But underneath that, each with a different meaning, personal, quiet, often more honest. For many, the day began early. Families dressed in layers, children polished their shoes, scarves were tied neatly. Those who had uniforms wore them proudly: military coats, school blazers, pioneer neckties. Ribbons were pinned to lapels. Red carnations were carried in bunches, their stems wrapped in newspaper. You made your way to the main street. Crowds gathered, loudspeakers crackled. The scent of wet asphalt and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Police officers stood by, straight-backed, bored. And then it began. Parade. It was never chaotic, never wild. It moved like a wave, organized, deliberate. Factory workers marched together, each holding signs with the name of their enterprise. Students marched behind banners bearing their school number. Veterans were given pride of place, their chests heavy with medals, their eyes sometimes distant. People clapped, politely. Children waved paper flags. Balloons bobbed above the crowd. A man on stilts walked by. A woman dressed as Mother Russia smiled through painted lips. The brass band played. Always a brass band, above it all. The giant portraits of Lenin and Marx were held high, solemn against the bright sky. Sometimes Brezhnev, sometimes a local party leader, depending on the year. The faces looked down not with joy but with certainty. And yet, despite the script, people smiled. They had old friends in the crowd. They bought sunflower seeds and lemonade from street vendors. They let their children run ahead, weaving through legs and laughter. Not because they believed, necessarily, but because the day was theirs too. A day off, a day out, a day away from the usual rhythm. After the parade, you went home. You changed clothes. You set the table, because Soviet holidays were not just public. They were personal. They continued. In the kitchen, a simple feast was laid out: boiled potatoes, pickled mushrooms, slices of sausage or fish, beet salad, black bread. If it was a good year, a cake from the local cafe. If it was to our parents, to those who couldn't be here, to the children, may their lives be easier than ours. Sometimes someone got too drunk. Sometimes someone cried. Sometimes someone played the accordion, or sang a song from the old country, or recited a poem from memory. Eyes shining. And outside, in courtyards across the country, other tables were being cleared. Other dishes were being washed. Other glasses were being raised. It was a celebration spread wide, not deep, but it was real in its way. Of course, not all holidays were joyous. Some were marked with silence. Remembrance Day, the anniversary of the siege, days when flags were lowered, not raised, when candles were lit in quiet corners, when people stood still in snow-covered cemeteries, scarves pulled tight against the wind, remembering names no longer spoken. But even then there was unity. Even then there was the strange comfort of knowing that across a vast country others were remembering too, because Soviet holidays were never just about history. They were about rhythm, about shared experience, about standing in a crowd and realizing, for better or worse, that you were not alone. And so they lingered, even after the banners were packed away, even after the streets emptied, even after the loudspeakers went silent. What remained was not the speech, not the slogan, not the music, but the moment, the memory, the shared breath of a people rising together. Winter in the Soviet Union was not a season, it was a presence, a silence, a softness that blanketed both hardship and beauty in equal measure. At first, snow never surprised anyone, yet it always felt like a beginning. One day the wind shifted and the air tasted different, cleaner, sharper. And then it came, soft, steady, slow, falling in thick flakes that caught in the streetlights and drifted down onto the city's gray shoulders like dust settling on an old coat. Snow transformed everything. It softened the hard edges of buildings, muffled the cough of the trolleybus, settled in the corners of balconies where forgotten boots had been left to dry. It turned even the most cracked sidewalk into something gentle, beautiful, in its quiet way. In the Soviet Union, winter was long. It did not come and go in a matter of weeks. It arrived and made itself comfortable. You learned to live alongside it. You prepared. You did not fight it, you adapted to it. In the cities, concrete met frost. Apartment blocks stood like frozen chips, their windows glowing faintly behind curtains drawn tight against the cold. Smoke curled from chimneys, slow and blue in the pale afternoon sky. Park benches disappeared beneath drifts. Trees, bare and brittle, cast long, tired shadows on snow that crunched like salt beneath your boots. People moved more slowly in winter, not because they were lazy, but because movement was harder. Scarves wrapped twice, sometimes 3 times, brown necks, coats thick and heavy, wool socks under rubber boots, gloves lined with fur, and always a hat. To step outside without one was unthinkable, foolish, dangerous. The tram cars steamed from within, their windows fogged with breath. Passengers sat in silence, their cheeks red, mittens in their laps, plastic shopping bags at their feet, a boy's nose pressed to the glass, tracing patterns in the condensation. A grandmother holding a jar wrapped in newspaper, careful not to let it crack in the cold, and yet there was beauty in it all. In the way street lamps glowed golden through the falling snow, in the way children played unbothered by the cold tossing snowballs, dragging sleds, building snowmen with mismatched scarves and broomsticks, in the way couples walked slowly arm in arm, their steps side by side in the fresh white powder. At home, winter changed the sound of things. Radiators clanged and hissed. Windows rattled softly in the wind. The kettle whistled longer. Socks hung drying above the stove. Blankets were added to beds. You boiled potatoes not just to eat, but to add warmth to the kitchen. You baked bread, more often, not just for hunger, but for comfort. There were rituals. You kept boots by the door, packed with old newspaper. You carried a bag of salt to scatter on the stairs. You put plastic film over the windows to keep out the drafts. You dried mittens on radiators. You rubbed hands together before turning the key in the lock. And when you came home from the cold, there was that moment, a moment of stepping inside, of removing the hat, the coat, the scarf, of feeling your face again, of breath no longer fogging, of warmth, real or imagined, seeping slowly back into your bones. Winter was not just weather. It was a part of life. In the villages, it was deeper still. Paths were shoveled by hand, narrow and twisting between wooden fences, so piled on rooftops like wool blankets. Chickens squawked from barns. The sky stayed gray for weeks, but inside, the stove glowed, the samovar steamed, woolen shawls were spread over knees, and tales were told as frost painted ferns across the windows. Electricity sometimes failed. You lit candles, listened to the radio, its static filling the gaps in conversation. You played card games, sewed, sat with your thoughts. Winter slowed everything. It taught you stillness. Holidays came, New Year's, not Christmas, a tree decorated with tinsel and chocolates wrapped in colored foil, a small gift, a toast, a song sung in low voices, more for memory than celebration. But even after the holidays, winter remained. It stayed through February, sometimes March, sometimes longer. It made you dream of the dacha, of sun, of green things, but it also gave you time to think, to be, to rest in the hush of snow falling on a city asleep. People grew tired of it, yes, but they also found peace in it, in the repetition, in the rituals, in the shared understanding that this too was part of life, because when snow fell on concrete, it didn't erase the cracks, but it covered them, just for a while. It made the world quiet, bearable, sometimes even beautiful. And in that silence, people remembered how to endure, how to hope, how to wait. In the gray light of early morning, when the steam rose from chimneys, and boots echoed on wet concrete, the factory called and millions answered, not with joy, but with a steady, enduring step. It began not with the sun, but with the whistle, a long, low cry from a distant tower that swept across the rooftops, through alleys, down stairwells. It rose like steam, woke dogs, stirred children beneath blankets. It was not urgent, not angry, just steady, a sound older than alarm clocks, older almost than memory. The factory was beginning its day, and so were you. Work was not just a part of life in the Soviet Union. It was the spine of it, the structure that held everything in place. You were born into labor. You were educated for it. You were celebrated for doing it well. You were expected to do it always. And so, when the whistle sounded, people moved. They dressed in darkness. They buttoned coats while bread toasted. They kissed children goodbye with quick hands. They joined the others walking through the streets, heavy boots splashing through slush, lunch pails swinging from one gloved hand, not quickly, not slowly, just in rhythm. The factories waited, monuments of brick and steel, windows fogged from within, chimneys coughing white smoke into the gray sky. Some were textile plants, others made tools, others shoes, still others parts of machines that would never be seen in the places they were used. What they made mattered, yes, but more than that, it mattered that they were made. Each had its own whistle, its own schedule, its own smell. Inside, there was noise, the drone of machines, the rattle of gears, the rhythmic hiss of steam, voices, but only just audible above it all, instructions given with gestures, greetings mouthed and nodded, the language of work. You changed into your uniform. Overalls, scarf, gloves. You found your station. You did not question it. You did what was assigned for. Then back to it. Some factories had music, a radio in the corner, marches, mostly, songs about unity, labor, peace. Some workers sang along softly, some did not. There were posters on the wall, portraits of heroes, slogans in bold red letters. 5-year plan and 4 work is honor. They faded over time, curled at the corners, but no one removed them. Supervisors passed through, clipboards, frowns, notes scribbled, sometimes praise, more often indifference. You were not expected to shine. You were expected to show up, to perform, to endure, and people did, because work meant more than money. It meant access. Your apartment came through work, your child's place in kindergarten, your vacation voucher, your ration coupons, your identity. You were a lathe operator, a weaver, a welder, a technician. These were more than roles. They were how you introduced yourself. Women worked too, side by side with men, hair tied up, hands skilled. They lifted, measured, directed. They worked a shift, then came home to cook dinner, help with homework, wash the floor. No one asked how. They just did it. Accidents happened, machines broke, backs ached, eyes strained, but no one spoke much of it. There were reward certificates. Sometimes a photograph in the hallway display, a badge, a bonus, a smile from the factory director. These were small things, but they mattered. At the end of the shift, the whistle blew again, and people returned the way they came, through snow, through slush, through the long shadows of winter afternoons. They stopped at the store if there was time, bought bread if there was any, picked up a newspaper, a bottle, a word with the neighbor. At home, they removed their boots, their coats, their silence. They sat down at the kitchen table and let the day settle. They didn't complain. Not much, not often. There was no one to complain to, and besides, everyone else was doing the same. This was life, honest, necessary, real. Some found joy in it, others only duty. But all found rhythm, because in the clatter of the machines, the slow sway of bodies at work, in the steam rising from mugs at break time, there was something more than labor. There was dignity. And though the work was hard, and the reward small, it gave shape to the day. It gave purpose to the whistle. And when sleep finally came, it came quickly, deeply, not from restfulness but from exhaustion earned honestly, hour by hour. In a world of ration books and concrete blocks, a wedding was a moment of joy unfolding in laughter and toasts, in slightly wrinkled suits and borrowed shoes, and always in hope. I didn't need to be extravagant. It couldn't be. The Soviet wedding wasn't measured in luxury. There was no obsession with rings or dresses or seating charts. It was not about displays. It was about the moment itself, about standing before friends, family, and the state to say, we begin here. And yet, there was always effort, always a quiet determination to make it special, despite the limits. A white dress borrowed from a cousin, a veil sewn by a neighbor, a suit brushed and mended, sometimes slightly too tight, a bouquet assembled from what was in bloom or from flowers bought in secret with saved-up rubles from a friend who knew a friend at the florist. The ceremony was official, always, in a government building known as the ZEGS, the registry office. There, among gray walls and polished linoleum, young couples signed their names before a stern-faced clerk. There were no priests, no churches. Religion was private quiet, if it happened at all. The state alone made it official. Still, there were touches of beauty, a ribbon pinned across the bride's chest, a song played from a cassette deck, a kiss sometimes shy, sometimes bold, and photographs, always photographs, posed in front of fountains, statues, Lenin's bust, war memorials. The backdrop didn't matter. What mattered was freezing the moment, the bride's smile, the groom's awkward pride, the wind catching the hem of her dress. And then came the feast. It didn't take place in a ballroom, more often. A home, a shared flat, a narrow room with extra chairs brought in from the neighbors, tables pushed together covered with mismatched cloths, and trays of food prepared over days. Boiled potatoes, pickled cucumbers, herring, cold cuts, beet salad. If someone had connections, there might be chicken or fish or a small cake from the bakery, layered with cream that melted too quickly in the heat of the room. But most importantly, there was vodka. Bottles lined the table like sentries. Clear glass, no frills, no labels beyond the standard seal. Poured into shot glasses, or mismatched teacups, or whatever was available. And the toasts began. There was an order to it. The first, always to the couple, to their future, to love. Then to the parents, the grandparents, the friends, then to absent ones, then to luck, then to peace, and finally to life itself. Za Lyubov, the shastis of Oz. The glasses clinked, and the room grew warmer. Faces flushed, coats were taken off, songs were sung loud, slightly off-key. Familiar to everyone, folk tunes, old romances, sometimes revolutionary songs repurposed into irony or joy. The guitar was passed around, or the accordion pulled from its case, its wheeze filling the room like breath. Laughter followed, stories, dancing in tight spaces between the table and the cupboard. On rugs worn thin by generations, a barefoot aunt twirling with a teenage nephew, a cousin climbing onto a chair to shut another toast, a bride wiping tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of it all, the tension, the joy. The vodka. And amid it all, small details. A child asleep on a pile of coats in the hallway, a candle flickering on a windowsill, a cat slinking between legs, a father quietly slipping an envelope into the groom's pocket, a grandmother holding the bride's hand just a moment longer than needed. No one expected perfection. The joy was found in what was, not what could have been. And after the feast, after the final song, after the last guest had stumbled into the street singing softly, scarf askew, the couple would return to their new home, a room in someone's flat perhaps, a mattress on the floor, a kettle on the stove, the beginning of a life together, not marked by grandeur, but by presence. And in the days that followed, there were photos to be printed, letters to write, a name to get used to, perhaps a new towel, a gift from a friend, perhaps nothing more. Then the echo of laughter in the kitchen, still lingering in the air. In the Soviet Union, weddings were not fairy tales, but they were real, they were full, they were fought for. They were a kind of promise, not just between two people, but to life itself, that even in concrete cities and rationed days, something could still begin, that two people could still look at one another and say, yes, we will. And in that, there was hope. From kitchen shelves to factory walls, from distant apartments to military barracks, the voice of the radio filled the quiet, steady, familiar, and always just present enough to matter. It was always there, even when the windows were shut, even when the neighbors were asleep, even when the city seemed to exhale into silence. The radio played, Sometimes loud, sometimes low, sometimes only as a hum in the background, like breath. But it was there. You didn't need to think about it. You simply turned the dial in the morning and let the sound settle into the corners of the room. The news, the weather, the music, the same jingles, the same voices, a sense of time, of rhythm, of the world beyond your walls, even if it rarely changed. The radio was in the kitchen, mostly, resting on a shelf near the kettle, propped up on a stack of old newspapers, hung from a nail above the stove, its wires bent, its casing yellowed from years of steam and dust. Sometimes it crackled, sometimes it lost the signal. You tapped it with the back of a spoon. It returned. The day began with its voice. Before you'd even buttoned your shirt or poured your first cup of tea, it had already greeted you. Dobro utro, tovarishi. Good morning, comrades. The announcer's tone was always the same, clear, firm, slightly distant, as though coming from a great height. They read the news from a script, precise and smooth. Reports from the party congress. Production achievements from the Donbas region. Weather forecasts for Novosibirsk. The latest from the dairy output in Tatarstan. It didn't matter where. It mattered that it was said. And in between, music, marches. Yes, always the marches. Brassy, steady, forward-moving. But also lullabies, soft folk songs, ballads from old movies, state-approved pop. Sometimes a jazz tune slipped through, slightly distorted, its rhythm like a raised eyebrow. You listened closely, wondered how it got there. Then it was gone again. Children learned from the radio. There were programs just for them, stories, riddles, cheerful voices asking, "What sound does a bear make?" Or, "Can you count to 10 in German?" You sat cross-legged on the rug, chin in hands, listening to the voice like it belonged to a kind uncle you had never met. And in the evenings, the voice changed. It slowed. It soothed. It told you the time again, reminded you to boil your water, gently encouraged you to turn off the lights, to prepare for bed, to trust. Some families listened together, others alone. Some kept it on all day, even when no one was home. To make the had declared itself secular, scientific, rational. Religion, it said, belonged to the past. And yet, belief never quite left. It didn't disappear. It shifted. It moved indoors, into kitchens, into bedrooms, into memory. In some homes, a small icon still hung behind the curtain, not in the front room, but in a private corner above the bed or near the stove. The saints painted in gold leaf, their eyes soft, their halos worn by time, a candle beside them, not lit always, only on certain days, on quiet nights, on anniversaries of loss. Crosses were worn under shirts, tucked beneath layers of fabric, not to hide from shame, but from notice, from questions, from the possibility, small but real, that the wrong person might see, might report, might mark it down in some invisible file. Children were not taught religion in school. They were taught to revere the cosmos, to admire the progress of science, to sing songs about the harvest and the heroes of labor. And yet, some children still knew the words to ancient prayers, whispered to them by a grandmother's careful voice as they lay in bed, half asleep. Holidays were transformed. Easter became spring festival. Christmas was replaced by New Year's. But in some homes, people still colored eggs in secret, still baked special breads, still lit a candle in the dark, and said nothing aloud. Just let the light speak. Baptisms happened, but quietly, in private, often at night. A trusted priest, a silent gathering, a child wrapped in white, a few drops of water, a promise. Weddings, too. There was the official one, at the civil office papers. Signed, toasts made. But sometimes a second one followed. Not always, not for everyone. But when it happened, it was simple. A priest, a candle, a blessing. No one outside the room needed to know. And funerals were where belief most often returned. Even those who had long stayed silent found themselves saying a prayer, crossing themselves, lighting a candle. Something in the finality of parting made people reach for something older than the state. There were still churches that remained open. Not many, not loudly, but enough. Elderly women, mostly, filled the pews, dressed in headscarves, backs slightly bent, hands worn with age and work. They stood for hours, lit candles, kissed icons, sang hymns in thin, wavering voices that had outlived many governments. The priests wore old robes, their voices soft, their sermons careful. They knew what they could say and what they could only imply. They baptized, married, buried. They listened. They did not ask questions they didn't need to ask. And the believers, young and old, came not always for doctrine, but for peace, for silence, for the scent of beeswax and incense, for the soft rustle of a page turning in a prayer book, for something still. Some believed deeply, others only a little. Some weren't sure what they believed at all, but they came because something inside them needed the rhythm, the ritual, the reminder that beyond the party, beyond the parade, beyond the posters, there was a deeper quiet, a different kind of truth. And even those who did not practice still remembered the songs their mothers sang while kneading dough, the image of a candle flickering in the early hours, the way their grandmother crossed herself before sleep, not dramatically, not for show, but as a habitat's instinct. Faith in the Soviet Union was not fire. It was ember. It burned low. It burned carefully, but it burned still. It asked for no attention. It made no demands. It simply endured, and in that quiet endurance, it mirrored the people who carried it, not loudly, not publicly, but faithfully, in the quiet corners. In a country ruled not by chaos, but by paperwork. Life moved forward. Door paused indefinitely on the weight of rubber stamps, carbon paper, and the quiet shuffle of people waiting. There was a system for everything, and for every system, there was a form. To live in the Soviet Union meant learning the language of bureaucracy, not just the words, but the silences, the pauses, the process. You filled out forms to apply for work, for housing, for travel, for a new coat of paint for your building's stairwell. You filled out forms to prove what you already knew, that you existed. They came in triplicate, on thin gray paper that curled at the edges. The lines were narrow, the ink smudged, the pens always ran dry just before the last signature. You used a ruler to keep your writing straight. You used your best handwriting, legible, respectful. You brought documents with you, always originals, copies, more copies, and you waited. You waited in lines that snaked through drafty corridors, past dusty windows, under flickering bulbs. Government offices rarely changed. The walls were painted to colors: dark green on the bottom, pale yellow above. A potted plant in the corner, long since wilted. A bulletin board with papers that hadn't been updated in years. A clerk behind. A glass window, chewing a pencil. The sound of someone coughing. Of shoes squeaking on worn linoleum. There were no appointments. There was no system to the system. You came, Marie. You brought a book. You asked who was last in line, and someone pointed. You waited your turn. The clerk never smiled. They looked through you, not at you. They took your form without comment, stamped it with a dull thump, placed it in a stack that disappeared behind the counter, never to be seen again. They told you to come back next week, or next month, or eventually. They didn't say yes. They didn't say no. Just, we'll inform you. And so you went home. You checked the mailbox every day. The metal lid stuck. The key bent slightly. Inside, a letter might wait, thin, folded once, with the familiar government stamp. You held your breath. It might be approval. It might be rejection. It might be nothing at all, just a request for one more paper, One more certificate, one more proof of what you already proved before. There was always another stamp to get, another office to visit, another corridor to walk. You learned to navigate this maze not with maps, but with stories. Someone's cousin knew someone in the housing office. A coworker had once gone through the same process and could tell you which window to knock on, which official preferred chocolates, which form to fill out in blue ink instead of black. You didn't bribe, not openly, but you brought gifts, a box of sweets, a bottle of cologne, a pack of cigarettes tucked inside a folder, not for corruption, but for survival, for speed, for a chance, because without help, the wheels turned slowly, very slowly. There was humor in it, sometimes, a kind of resigned amusement. Jokes were told in lines. If you want to die, stand in the queue. By the time you reach the end, you'll forget why you were there. People laughed, not loudly, but enough to feel human again. And even those who worked in the offices, who sat behind the glass, who held the stamps, were not enemies. They were just as trapped, just as tired, just as lost in the maze. You saw it in their eyes, in the way they rubbed their temples, in the way they stared at the clock as if willing it to move faster. Children watched their parents navigate these systems and learned early. Life was not just lived, it was filed. You couldn't move to another city without permission. You couldn't change jobs without approval. You couldn't buy a car or a refrigerator or even a better coat without papers. But somehow, things moved. People moved, slowly, stubbornly. They persisted. Because bureaucracy didn't just slow life down. In its strange way, it shaped it. It gave you structure. Even if that structure was maddening, it taught you patience. It taught you how to listen between words, how to wait without giving up, how to speak without saying too much. And over time, it became normal. You carried your passport everywhere. You kept a folder of documents ready at all times. You knew your identification number by heart. You kept old papers, even when you didn't know why, because one day maybe they would be needed. Even now, many remember the sound of the stamp, the way it echoed slightly in the quiet of the office, the smell of the ink, the way the clerk would pause, glance at your form, and press it down with a soft finality. And somehow, that sound, small and unimpressive, was everything. It meant, now it is real, now it is allowed, now it exists, where power was displayed, in perfect formation, in steel and rhythm. And yet, within each uniform walked a boy with sore feet, cold hands, and a distant look in his eyes. Parades were impressive. They came with banners, with trumpets, with rows of boots striking pavement. In unison, the tanks rolled down wide boulevards. The warplanes flew overhead in perfect V formations. The rifles gleamed. The uniforms were pressed. The medals caught the sun, and the crowds applauded, even if they did not always cheer. These were military parades held on the big days: May 9th, November 7th, the anniversaries of victory, revolution, sacrifice. They were orchestrated with precision, filmed for television, broadcast to the nation. The message was clear: strength, unity, order. But behind the spectacle, behind the flags and drums, there were individuals, and many of them were boys, not children. No, but not far from it. 18, 19, 20, shoulders still narrow, faces still round, their expressions caught between pride and fatigue, honor and longing. They marched in formation. But inside, each one carried a different story. Some had grown up dreaming of this moment. Sons of veterans, proud to wear the boots their fathers once laced. Others had arrived reluctantly. After the letter came the mandatory service call that every young man received. No choice, no delay. The army was part of the path. It began with goodbyes, with a mother's arms wrapped tight, with a bag packed quickly, with a father's quiet nod at the train station. Then came training, early mornings, barked orders, blisters on the hands, cold bunkhouses, a photo of a girl folded in a pocket, letters written at night by flashlight, folded twice. never quite saying everything. And then the parade, the culmination of order. Each step counted, each turn measured, each button checked. They stood for hours before the march even began, shoulders back, chins up, eyes straight, waiting in the wind, in the rain, in the heat. It didn't matter. The cameras were watching. Their mothers watched too, at home, on flickering televisions, leaning close to the screen, hoping to spot their son in the sea of gray and green. Most never could. The uniforms were too similar, the faces too far. But still they watched, still they whispered, "There, that one, maybe that's him." And as the drums rolled and the boots moved forward, a strange feeling settled, not fear, not pride. Exactly, something quieter, the weight of being part of something so much larger than oneself, and yet feeling more alone than ever, because behind each marching soldier was the space he had left behind. A mother waiting for a letter, a girl writing poems she would never send, a village where his name had already been carved onto a school plaque, a younger brother wearing his old sweater. The army gave purpose, it gave routine, it gave stories to tell later. But it also took time, youth, sometimes hope, and sometimes more. There were those who never came home, whose names were never mentioned, whose stories were erased before they were told, accidents, illnesses, silence, a photograph taken away, a voice never discussed again. But for those who did return, the uniform left its mark. Even years later, the discipline remained, the habit of standing straight, the need to keep your belongings folded just so, the instinct to answer with yes, comrade, before thinking, and the parade remained, in memory, if not in life. The long walk down the boulevard, the weight of the rifle, the rhythm of the drum, the knowledge that, for one day at least, all eyes were on them. For a moment, they were symbols, strength, stability, order. But inside the uniform, under the cap, behind the sharp salute, there was always a boy, with sore feet, with a letter in his pocket, with a memory of home, with a name spoken only softly by those who waited. And when the music faded, when the flags were folded, when the boulevard emptied, the soldier remained quiet, alone, still walking, where medicine came with waiting and wisdom came from the old, and healing was found somewhere between boiled herbs and sterile hallways. You didn't go to the hospital unless you had to, not because you didn't trust the doctors, though some didn't, not because care was unavailable, though sometimes it was, but because you knew the hospital was not a place of comfort. It was a place of necessity. From the outside, they looked like schools or government offices, flat-roofed, pale walls, stairwells that echoed. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant. You could smell it before the doors opened, a mix of soap, bleach, and old linens. It stayed on your coat, in your hair, on your skin. The waiting room was its own world, wooden benches, a nurse's desk, a glass window where names were called. Children sat with flushed cheeks and wool scarves wrapped too tightly. Old women rubbed their knees, sighed, murmured to each other in low voices. A radio played faintly classical music, or the news, never loud enough to cover the coughs. You brought documents, always passport, medical card, referral paper. Sometimes a handwritten note from a local doctor. You waited. You were used to it. You didn't complain. The doctors were tired, overworked, often kind, often brisk. They wore white coats, threadbare at the cuffs. They spoke quickly, clipped. You listened closely, nodded, asked no questions. You weren't supposed to. They knew best. Prescriptions were handwritten, sometimes illegible. You took them to the pharmacy. Another queue, another bench, another form. You handed it to the woman behind the counter, her expression unreadable, and waited while she measured powders into tiny envelopes, labeled with pencil. Sometimes the medicine was there. Sometimes it wasn't. Then you were told to try another pharmacy, or to come back next week, or to do without. You made do. You boiled water. You rested. You drank hot tea with lemon if there was lemon, if not, raspberry jam. A spoonful stirred into the cup, steaming. You wrapped yourself in a wool blanket, even in summer. You sweated out. Because before the doctors, there were the old ways. Folk remedies, a cloth soaked in vinegar laid across the forehead, a mustard plaster on the chest, hot and prickling, garlic around the neck, a potato boiled and crushed into a poultice, wrapped in cheesecloth, placed on sore joints, salt water gargles, cups those glass domes warmed and pressed to the skin, until they pulled small circles of purple. It was not science, but it was what people knew. It was what grandmothers did, what mothers remembered, what neighbors whispered across stairwells. And often it worked, or seemed to, or gave comfort, because healing was not just about medicine. It was about care, a hand on the forehead, soup brought to the bedside, the sound of slippers in the next room, the quiet knowledge that someone was near. Hospitals had their place, but so did home, and many tried to heal there first. For more serious needs, you went in, you packed a bag, pajamas, soap, a towel, your own spoon. Hospitals did not provide comfort. You had to bring it with you. Wards were crowded, beds lined up in rows, one nurse, sometimes two, patients whispering in the night, a woman praying softly, a man snoring behind a curtain. Meals brought on trays, gruel, bread, weak tea. There were good doctors. There were great ones, talented surgeons, gentle nurses, men and women who did their work with quiet dedication despite shortages, despite salary, despite everything. They stayed late. They stitched wounds with care. They sat beside beds and held hands. But there were others too, tired ones, harsh ones, and many in between. You learned to be grateful for kindness, to notice it, to remember it. And when you left, if you left, you brought with you not just instructions, but stories, a scar, perhaps, a new superstition, a new respect for the woman who sat beside you, who shared her jam and her silence when words failed. You returned home changed, even if only a little, and as time passed, you carried both kinds of healing within you, the kind that came from bottles and paper, and the kind that came from steam, from soup, from songs hummed in the next room. Even now, if you ask someone how they healed, they'll tell you both. I went to the clinic, and my babushka made me drink a glass of hot milk with honey and baking soda, because in the Soviet Union, medicine was not just found in hospitals. It was in hands, in memory, in faith, in patience. And in the quiet belief that, somehow, we get better. Together. Where evenings unfolded in flickering monochrome, and the glow of a single screen stitched together a nation in silence, curiosity, and quiet ritual. It sat in the corner like a guest. The television. Not everyone had one. Not at first. It was expensive, difficult to find, a mark of fortune or connection, but over time it came slowly, one household at a time, one block at a time, until nearly every family, in every city and village, had one proudly, carefully placed atop a lace dory or wooden stand. It was heavy, boxy, humming softly. Sometimes the picture rolled. Sometimes the antenna needed adjustment, a wire coat hanger stuck into the top, bent just right. The screen was small, the casing large, and everything it showed was in black and white. But no one minded. It was a marvel. You turned it on with a pull of a knob, a flicker, a pop, a buzz. The screen came alive slowly, blooming into light from the center outward, like an eye opening after sleep. And with it came the voices. The voice of the news anchor, measured, formal, assured. The voice of the actor, clear, dramatic, sometimes dubbed over foreign lips. The voice of the children's show host, bright, warm, familiar. The voice of the narrator guiding you through war documentaries, space launches, or farm reports. The programs were not many. A handful of channels, if you were lucky, one or two if you weren't. The schedule was fixed, predictable. The evening news at 9, the cartoon hour at 6, the Sunday movie, the monthly concerts, New Year's specials that became tradition. You didn't flip through channels, you waited, you planned, you gathered. And when it began, The whole room went quiet. Children sat cross-legged on the carpet. Parents leaned back in chairs, slippers on, tea steaming beside them. Grandmothers were upon with half their attention. Teenagers rolled their eyes, but stayed anyway, and for a while nothing else mattered. There was something gentle about those evenings, the light of the screen dancing on walls, the rustle of pages as someone flipped through a newspaper during commercials, the hush that came with a suspenseful moment, the laughter that followed a shared joke. Most of the content was safe, approved, polished, carefully chosen. But within those boundaries, there were moments of sincerity, of magic. There were films classics, from the Soviet archives, adaptations of Tolstoy and Chekhov, romances that ended in quiet embraces, comedies that became legend, performances that were quoted in schools and factories the next day. There were cartoons not loud, not fast, but soft and patient, stories of kind bears, clumsy wolves, clever hares, animation drawn with care, music that lingered long after the credits, characters who felt like family. There were news reports, always positive, always polished. They showed harvests gathered, medals awarded, factories thriving. But behind the narration, people read the unspoken. They watched for what wasn't said, what was skipped, what had changed in tone. There were concerts, folk songs, ballets, piano recitals. Artists who wore suits and dresses, who bowed deeply, who thanked the audience not with grand gestures, but with quiet dignity. There were space launches, aired live, moments of awe, black and white images of rockets rising, of cosmonauts smiling, of mission control blinking. Children watched with wide eyes, parents watched with pride. The stars, it seemed, belonged to everyone. And there were the annual broadcasts, the New Year's address from the General Secretary, the holiday variety show, the long, slow countdown to midnight. Glasses raised, toasts made, the clink of crystal. In millions of homes at once. In villages where phones were rare and streets dark after dusk, television became a lifeline, a connection, a shared experience. Neighbors gathered in the one house that had a set, the room too small, the air too warm, the laughter too loud. In cities, it became background, a companion to dinner, to homework, to chores. In both, it became memory. Even now, decades later, people remember certain sounds, the melody of the cartoon intro, the theme music of the evening news, the gentle static of the test screen at night, just before the broadcast ended, because it did end always. There was number 24-hour television. At a certain hour, the music played, the image faded, the screen went dark, and the house felt quieter. The glow was gone, but its echo lingered. In the hush that followed, families finished their tea. Children were sent to bed. Grandmothers turned off their lamps, and somewhere, someone whispered, "Tomorrow at 6, the cartoon will return," and so it did, with the same voices, the same light, the same comfort. A world in black and white, but never cold. A world shared by millions yet felt intimately. A world where stories lived not loudly, not urgently, but gently, and always together. Where the air smelled of soil and smoke, where the clocks ticked slower, and where city hands remembered how to grow, mend, and breathe again. Beyond the rows of concrete apartment blocks, beyond the factories and the trolleybus lines, beyond the reach of grayness, there was the dacha, a small house, a garden, a patch of sky, not luxurious, not grand, but deeply loved. Dachas were not vacations. They were work, but a different kind of work, the kind that asked for sweat and patience and dirty fingernails, but gave something back, something green, something quiet. Most were modest wooden shacks with uneven floors, leaky roofs, windows that rattled in the wind. There was often no running water, no toilet, no stove beyond a rusted burner and a kettle blackened by years of use. The beds were hard, the blankets musty, the walls smelled of pine and rain. But none of that mattered, because outside the door there was life, a garden that, in early spring, still slept beneath snow, A narrow path cleared by shovel, leading from the gate to the steps. Seedlings kept, warm inside glass jars. Tools hung on nails, buckets stacked in the corner, a compost heap steaming quietly in the frost dot. And then came the thaw, earth turned soft, snow became mud. Fingers pried open frozen soil. Potato beds were marked with string. Onion bulbs were pressed gently into the earth. Cabbage seedlings waited. Under clear plastic, every inch of land was used, planned, planted, protected. Children helped, or pretended to. They chased each other with watering cans, dug shallow holes with spoons, got scolded for trampling the dill. Elderly women knelt for hours, weeding, humming old songs under their breath. Elderly men repaired fences with bent nails, nodded to. Neighbors with quiet respect sipped tea from chipped enamel mugs between tasks. There were no alarms, no schedules, but there was always something to do. A chicken coop to mend, a window to reglaze, a fire to build for the bathhouse, a wheelbarrow to fix, a row of cucumbers to tie, a bucket of berries to pick. And when the sun began to dip low long before the cities turned on their street lamps, the dacha became something softer. Lanterns were lit, samovars steamed. Smoke curled upward from small stoves. The garden, now quiet, glistened in the dew. Evenings were simple, a sliced tomato, a piece of black bread, cucumbers in salt water, a hard-boiled egg, sometimes soup, made from whatever had been pulled from the soil that morning, sometimes just tea, drunk slowly on the porch. While mosquitoes hummed in the distance, neighbors passed by on the path, nodded, said nothing, or they stopped, shared pickles, shared stories, shared silence, because the dacha wasn't just a garden. It was a sanctuary. From the noise, from the eyes, from the state, from the routine. Here, people planted what they wanted, ate what they grew, made choices, even small ones, with their own hands. It was a kind of freedom, earthy, messy, real. For the children, the dacha was summer, shoes lost in the mud, sunburned noses, sticky fingers from stolen raspberries, naps in hammocks, rainstorms watched from under tin roofs. For the adults, it was survival. Extra food, jars of preserves lined up in the pantry, buckets of potatoes stored under the bed for winter, a sense that, if nothing else, you could still grow something, feed your family, keep your hands busy. And for the old it was memory, of villages long gone, of childhoods before war, of days when the soil was the only constant. Even now, people remember their family's dacha with a kind of reverence. The way the cherry tree bent in the wind, the creak of the back gate, the smell of wet wood after a storm, the taste of the first radish pulled from the ground, dusted on a sleeve, eaten whole, because in a country that asked so much, the dacha gave something back. Not rest, exactly, not comfort, always, but space, breath, and a patch of earth that, in its quiet ways, said, "This is yours, this you may tend, this you may keep," where children lined up in neat rows, recited the names of heroes, and carried the silent pressure of becoming the future the state had already written. It began with a bell, not a shrill alarm, but a clear, deliberate ringing, mechanical, familiar. It echoed through stairwells and hallways that smelled faintly of chalk, wool, and floor polish. Children in uniform filed in with quiet obedience, sat at wooden desks, opened dog-eared notebooks. This was school in the Soviet Union. Every morning began with ceremony. The flag raised, the anthem sung low, a little off-key, but full of meaning. A short speech from the head teacher, sometimes the mention of a student who'd done something well, sometimes a reminder of a holiday. Then the classes began. The desks were hard, the rules harder. Posture mattered, haircuts mattered, handwriting mattered. Boys wore dark pants, light shirts, red pioneer neckerchiefs knotted tightly. Girls wore brown dresses with white aprons, pigtails tied with stiff bows. Everyone looked nearly the same, tidy, contained, quiet. The teacher entered. Everyone stood. "Good morning, Comrade Ivanova." "Good morning, class. Sit down." There was math, Stern, exact, purposeful. Not about curiosity but certainty. Answers were memorized. Methods followed. You raised your hand, but only if you were sure. Mistakes brought frowns. Not learning moments. There was literature. Pushkin, Lermontov, Gorky, always with a message. Not just beauty, but usefulness. What did this poem teach about duty, about sacrifice, about the Soviet spirit? There was history, but not all of it, only the parts that mattered. The revolution, the Civil War, the great patriotic victory. Heroes in red, villains in black. The timeline simple, the meaning clear, names memorized, dates recited. Geography, biology, physics, they were there too, but always framed in usefulness. What does this tell us about how to build, how to grow, how to strengthen the motherland? The walls of the classroom reminded you, portraits of Lenin, of Marx. Slogans, study well to serve the country. Charts showing agricultural quotas. Maps where the USSR stretched proud and wide across half the globe. But amid all this structure, there were softer moments. A teacher who read poetry with tears in her voice. A boy who whispered jokes behind his textbook. A girl who shared her sandwich at lunch. A snowball fight after school. Boots sinking into deep drifts. Laughter echoing into alleys. Lunch was served in the canteen. A tray, a bowl of soup. A plate of buckwheat with meat or something like it. Tea always warm, bread, sometimes with a smear of jam. It wasn't always enough, but it was shared. And you sat beside friends, and that helped. Outside of class, you were expected to join things. The young pioneers, the komsomol, you marched, you sang, you cleaned the schoolyard, you clapped for guests, you recited pledges. You practiced being good citizens, orderly, cheerful, obedient. There were after-school clubs, chess, singing, model, rocket building, gymnastics in leotards that smelled of dust and chalk, marching drills in freezing courtyards. Not everyone loved it, but most did their best. Because the future was already spoken for. You were not just learning for yourself, were learning for the nation. To become an engineer, a soldier, a teacher, a doctor, something useful. Parents reminded their children gently or sternly, study well, behave, be proud, you're lucky to be here. And in many ways, they believed it, for they had seen worse: war, hunger, silence, and school with all its rules. And routines was safety, a way forward. Even the strictest teachers, behind closed doors, smiled sometimes, wrote encouraging notes in neat red ink, stayed late to tutor, brought in apples from their gardens, treated their students not as statistics, but as people. And when graduation came after exams and ceremonies and awkward group photos, there was pride, not just personal, but national. You were part of something. You were becoming the next chapter, even if you were scared, even if you weren't sure. And years later, when those students became parents themselves, they walked their own children to the school gates, smoothed their collars, reminded them to sit straight, and whispered, "All begins here," where an empire did not fall in fire or fury, but in hushed conversations, in empty shelves, and in the quiet weight of things no longer working. There was no explosion, no sirens, no breaking glass. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it did so quietly, like a machine slowly running out of parts, like a song that faded before the final note. There had been signs, of course, for years, cracks in the pavement, whispers in the hallway, shelves that stayed bare longer than usual, offices that stopped answering phones, television reports that spoke with less certainty than before. But most people, ordinary people, were not thinking of revolutions. They were thinking of dinner, of how to fix the faucet, of where to find shoes for the child who had grown overnight. Then things began to vanish, bit by bit. Money still existed, but it meant less. Prices rose, rubles shrank, wages didn't come on time. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Shops stood half empty, not just in villages, but in cities. Long lines formed for bread, for sugar, for milk. You learned to carry a bag with you always, just in case. If you saw a line, You joined at first and asked later what it was for. There were vouchers, slips of paper promising a future share in some vast, invisible thing called privatization. No one quite understood them. Some sold them cheap, others kept them like lottery tickets. A few got rich, most did not. Factories closed, some slowly, some overnight. Men who had spent 30 years at the same machine were told they were no longer needed, not because of failure, but because the machine itself had stopped fitting the world. Borders opened, and with them came color, jeans, chewing gum, Western cartoons on new television channels. Words like market capital, reform. But with the color came uncertainty. Pensioners who had once been respected teachers, doctors, engineers found themselves selling matches at the metro, or flowers from their garden on the sidewalk, not out of ambition, but need. Young people rushed to learn new words, new currencies, new rules. They opened kiosks, started businesses, imported electronics and ideas. Some failed, some flourished, but no one knew the rules anymore. Corruption bloomed quietly. Like mold behind wallpaper, bribes became normal. Connections became currency. The old certainties vanished, and in their place came improvisation. For the first time in generations, faith returned loudly. Churches reopened. Icons reappeared. Candles were lit in public again. Not everyone believed, but everyone noticed. And amid all of it, people kept going. They lined their windows with pickles. They planted more in their gardens. They borrowed and bartered. They sewed their own coats. They shared, not always joyfully, sometimes bitterly, but they shared, because survival was no longer guaranteed, and no one could do it alone. For those who had grown up knowing only the red banners, the five-pointed stars, the slogans and songs, it was like waking from a dream, and for some, it felt like betrayal, not because they loved everything that had come before, but because they had built their lives on its promises, pensions, employment, pride. And now those promises lay folded away in drawers, next to medals, ration cards, and black and white photographs. Children adapted. They always do. They learned new alphabets, new histories, new hopes. But the adults watched with quieter eyes, and when asked later what it had felt like, they didn't say revolution. They didn't say freedom. They didn't say collapse. They said, it changed. We woke up, and it was different. No one told us what to do next. And so, in the absence of instruction, they returned to what they knew: how to endure, how to adapt, how to wait for spring. In the end, after the borders were redrawn and the maps were written, after the statues were taken down and new flags were hoisted in their place, after the documents were stamped and the ministries renamed and the slogans replaced with newer, shinier ones, what remained was not a nation or a system, but something quieter, something softer, something deeply personal. What remained was memory, not the kind found in history books, edited and republished, but the kind that clings to the back of the mind, to the folds of old coats, to the smell of boiled potatoes, to the creak of a stair in a communal flat. People remembered not the headlines, but the texture of daily life. They remembered the long lines, yes, but also the conversations in those lines, the quiet nods of solidarity. The way a stranger might whisper, "They'll bring sausage yet," free, and the way that whisper felt like a gift. They remembered the taste of factory-made bread, dense and sour, and the way it was softened with raspberry jam from a neighbor's dacha. They remembered pioneer pens and schoolyard chants, yes, but also the warmth of a teacher's voice when the heating failed, the hush of a classroom reciting poetry, the shared pencil passed from desk to desk. They remembered the strictness, the rules, the surveillance, the fear, but also the jokes whispered in kitchens, the irony tucked into every conversation, the coded language that made speech an art form. They remembered the noise of the city, trams clattering over rails, radios tuned to the same state channel, the wheeze of the radiator, the slap of felt boots on icy sidewalks. But more than that, they remembered the quiet, The thick quiet of winter dawns when the world was still wrapped in snow and every sound seemed far away. The silence after the television went off for the night. The soft sigh of a kettle just before it boiled. The rustle of pages in a book borrowed from the library, read under blankets with a flashlight. The world outside forgotten. They remembered people. The grandmother who always knew which herbs would calm a fever. The neighbor who fixed your door without asking. The coworker who slipped you a little sugar when none could be found in the shops. The friend who waited with you in line for medicine neither of you would get. These were the real monuments, not bronze or granite, but flesh and memory. Because when systems fall, what survives is habit. What survives is resilience. What survives is the way people adapt and endure and carry each other forward. They taught their children to reuse everything, to never throw away string, to turn a broken jar into a windowsill garden. They taught thrift and patience and how to fix a radio with tinfoil. They told stories not always proudly, not always angrily, but with the weight of truth. And they did not forget. Even those who left, who boarded planes or trains for brighter futures, carried it all with them. The cadence of the language, the rhythm of scarcity, the tenderness of hardship shared. You could hear it in their lullabies, in the way they buttered bread, in how they held disappointment gently in their hands, not with rage, but with understanding. And those who stayed, they rebuilt slowly and evenly. With false starts and pauses and bursts of hope, they watched new buildings rise. New currencies replace old, new leaders promise better. But beneath it all, in the hush between events, they remembered. They remembered that life is more than governments, more than plans, more than 5-year targets and televised parades. It is tea shared in chipped cups. It is frost on a windowsill. It is a grandmother's hands. It is the quiet pride of surviving. And in that, the Soviet Union never truly vanished, not in the way maps do. It dissolved, yes, it changed, but it left behind millions of people shaped by its shadow, strengthened by its weight, softened by the ordinary beauty they made within its walls. And now, years later, when someone asks, what was it like? The answer rarely begins with politics. It begins with the smell of cabbage, the sound of footsteps in a stairwell, the feeling of a winter coat passed down through 3 siblings. It begins with the phrase, it was hard, but we lived. And in that living, in that enduring, in that long, slow journey through gray cities and bright gardens and heavy silences, something remained, something human, something enduring, and that, more than any slogan or state, is what history leaves behind, not glory, not tragedy, but life.